Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Pathfinder Report. My name is Joel Gruey. I'll be running point as your host today. In the studio with me today is my good friend and a board member of Project Pathfinder, and if you've been around Generation Joshua or around me too long, you might know him, but if not, his name is Daniel Heffington. Daniel, thank you for joining us on the show today. We really appreciate it.
Glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, glad to. It's good to see you again. I want to give a brief introduction to Daniel first, since he's our guest, and technically he's never been on the Pathfinder Report before, though I have to give him some grief at some point, because the last time he and I sat down to do a podcast, he was in my spot and I was in his, where he was the one playing host and me the interview. So this is kind of a bit of tables turned moment, and it's a little weird. I might be sitting here waiting for you to ask the next question and realizing it's my job, not the other way around. Anyway, that being said, Daniel and I have had the privilege of working together for years, almost a decade plus over our careers. But he is now currently both a board member and the chaplain of Project Pathfinder on our board. He's also a Future of Freedom Fellow at the National Review Institute, where he helps advance NRI's mission in developing leaders and principal leaders and strengthening the intellectual foundations of a free society. A slightly fancier, more grown-up version of what we do here at Project Pathfinder, to be honest. He helps work on their Burke to Buckley Fellowship program. But before he did that, he actually spent over a decade leading communications and program development and a bunch of different work at Generation Joshua and HSLDA Action right alongside me. We traveled all around the United States. We taught tens of thousands of students understanding their responsibilities as citizens and leaders, and advancing kind of pro-family, pro-freedom legislation across the U.S., but particularly federally, working with congressional offices, building partnerships with other organizations. Daniel and I have gone way back, so we'll try to keep the inside jokes to a dull roar and not be completely overwhelming tonight. So we'll see how far we get there. That said, he also lives in Virginia with his wife Abigail and their 3 kids and a bunch of pets, and is probably going to tell some of those stories as we go along, as well as, of course, serving on the board with me at Project Pathfinder. So it is a pleasure to have you, Daniel. Thank you so much for joining us again. Actually, maybe this. For the listeners on the show who don't know you yet, and we keep having more each month, so that's always nice. Right. Can you maybe start by giving us like a 30-second version of who you are, how you got here, kind of fill in the stuff that I glossed over as I was moving too fast?
Sure. No, I think you did a great job encapsulating what's like 13 to 15 years of life for the two of us. To just kind of fill in some of the blanks, you hit the big arcs. But I've been involved in the conservative advocacy space, freedom advocacy space for a long time through my work with Generation Joshua. Before that, I worked with the Virginia Family Foundation and did the kind of freelance campaign politics thing for a little while. Then I decided that, not traveling every day was like a good idea. And so I've been in this space for a long time. Again, the vast majority of my career to this point has been with you and Generation Joshua and HSLDA Action. Had so many good memories and too many significant things to even put into words. But, we got to advance some of just the most important issues facing our country today and do it with some of the best people. And just other kind of like filler information for anyone who doesn't know me. In addition to doing the whole politics and advocacy thing, I do music. I'm a songwriter and a worship leader.
Very talented one, I might add. Yes.
Thank you. That's very nice of you.
We'll put a link to your Spotify profile in this when we're done, because if you guys haven't heard his music, it's really good.
There you go. I can get 25 more cents or something out of that Spotify.
We do what
royalty.
We
can. I do it for the love, because that's the only way to make those Spotify statements not crush your soul. Anyways, yeah, that's a big encapsulation. I'm sure more will come out as we talk.
Oh, sure. We'll try to be choosy in our stories and only tell the really good ones, and maybe keep the ones that might get us in trouble appropriately buried.
I can't promise that we won't have a few inside jokes, but we'll try to keep it, relatable.
So you and I spent a lot of time together working in youth civics education, in equipping and activism. We traveled all around the U.S. and did a lot of stuff there. But you've kind of moved from, if you wanted to be uncharitable, call it youth pastor role, into full pastor role, where you're working with adults now. Or you could say there's some element of growing up, which in one sense is something we want all of the students that came through Gen J to do, and we'll want the students that are in Pathfinder to do. where they take what they learn and go out into the world and use it in good and productive ways.
Yeah.
But it's a little different than when you were staffing it to go do that than when you were a student in it. And granted, you both were a student in Gen J and staffed at Gen J. And now
Yeah.
we're taking what you learned in that role out into, at this point, into national review and using it. So, like, what are some things that you've been able to take that have been useful from then that you're able to use now?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. I will say working with grown-ups, and doing events with grown-ups is both far more predictable and calm in some ways, and also far more boring in some ways, meaning like I don't get to like run around a convention center helping the blue party or the gold party, because I was always a flip-flopper between those, but go get votes or something. It's like those kind of things. I still have to show up and do some Pathfinder events to be able to get my fill of that. But the one thing that's really the same, aside from the kind of lighthearted answer, is so many of the issues, the conversations, the dynamics facing people of principle and oftentimes faith and people who love freedom in politics. That's like still the same conversations and the same issues that we're all wrestling with. It's not like you get a different packet when you go and do the the grown up version. It's like and I'll say also this speaks to the caliber of both Gen J and Pathfinder students and the program itself. That it's like we're not doing training wheels. We're doing training wheels politics in the sense of this isn't real Congress when you're at a Pathfinder I advocate or something.
Sure,
but the ideas they're not training wheel ideas. They're the real the real the real ones that we all wrestle with. And I guess what that means is, sometimes you're going to see teenagers be a little more hot-headed, a little more impetuous. But I always kind of check people, because it's like, just when you think the teenagers are the hot-headed, impetuous ones, go hang out with some real politicians, or go hang out with some real politicos, or the people, volunteering on the campaign or something. It's not that different. And it's like the thing that I will say is, working with students, there's an inspiration there, because sometimes there's like way more hope and way less jadedness than. And I'm not saying I'm still in my role today. I'm getting to work with some of the best, most inspiring people out there, but just if you go around the country talking to adults in politics, you're going to run into more of that burnout, that tendency, maybe a temptation to despair or something about the state of the nation, than maybe you would with teenagers. And I think that's something that teenagers have that grown-ups should have more of.
Well, I very much appreciate the fact that it seems that the work we do to make this real and accurate is proving itself true when you move into those circles.
Oh yeah.
That's really good to hear and really encouraging. Thank you.
Yeah.
Also, for the record, the next time you want to run around in costume or do something else, there is a standing invite to our next conference down in Florida that you have been specifically asked for.
Oh, that's very nice.
And admittedly, I was having great fun a couple weekends last weekend going down there, and I got to run around with a hat and a sword. There is some perks to working with teens. You don't get to do in a normal day to day.
I will never forget you and me marching around the outside of the actual Canadian Parliament, carrying, I think, a mace,
saw that picture,
and something else,
and the big hat.
Yeah, and the big hat, and we've had some adventures, Joel. We
did that program down last week, and I was wearing the hat. It was great. You'll have to see it. I got an upgrade to the outfit. All right. That said, we'll keep the inside jokes thing. You also, I mentioned this earlier, you also serve as the chaplain on the Pathfinder board, which for those people that know you or have interacted with you at Gen J, you've kind of driven or led in a lot of the spiritual formation aspects of what we've done. You've always led worship at our chapels. You are one of the people that joined me on stage to teach and to preach, as it were. That is something of a unique role. We've only got one chaplain. That is probably where we look a little different, like a political shop, and more like a ministry.
Sure.
But there's an element of that that motivates you personally. Can you take a moment and just talk about how the way your faith shapes the way you work in kind of society and the civic space, because a lot of people say that you really can't do the faith and politics thing. We've long held that's not true. You live
Right.
that out very practically.
Sure. Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you. That's a very kind assessment. I think the honest answer is going back to, before I answer how does faith impact my relationship to politics, how does faith impact my relationship to life? And it's, for me, it's that foundational, nucleus of what it means to be a human in the world is my identity, my purpose, my assignment is found in my relationship with Jesus Christ. And it's, that means that now when I'm saying this, I'm talking about the ideal. I'm not saying that, this
We're
is
not
where
perfect,
I
right? We don't get
exist
this right
in
every time.
perfection every day,
Yes,
but it's like,
yes.
this is in all of my, 35 years of life, that's the place where I've found reliability, where I've found peace, where I've found something that makes sense of this thing we call life.
Mm-hmm.
And thus, it's my starting point for where I'm going to go into anywhere. If it's a relationship with a neighbor or a family member or somebody I love, if it's, something I'm doing in my community, if it's something I'm doing with a friend, not that I'm going to churchify it all, but it's going to be, if it's that C.S. Lewis, talks about what is basically the realist reality. It is the ultimate reality that anything that is, good, true, or beautiful in my world is colored and ultimately found in my faith walked out. And so when it comes to politics, it's that very frankly American and Western civilization idea of, in America, we have the freedom of religion. The state does not control religion. But if you read the writings of our founders, religion was the expectation. Faith was the expectation as the starting point for civic virtue, as the starting point for people who could be trusted to have a voice in a democratic republic. You can read some really spicy writings from many of our founding fathers about how dangerous it is to let just so-and-sos who have no moral framework, go elect people. Now, does that give you concern for, modern times or something? It could.
Maybe it should.
But there's all that to say, that idea isn't something that we came up with. That's been at the backbone of this whole, both Christians around the world, but also Christians in America. How do we engage this thing? That's our one of our big significant callings. As Christians, our ultimate citizenship is in heaven, but we believe that we were put in a place and a time for a very specific reason. And so, so our faith informs what we do in those spaces. And then, of course, we spend a ton of time debating the application of our faith to those spaces and saying, what does it look like and what does it mean? But, even with politics, my faith is the thing that drove me into that. When I was young, I came across and learned about the pro-life cause in the issue. And I had a bunch of siblings growing up, and I didn't love them all the time, but I really loved them.
I understand that.
So
yes.
It blew my mind. I was like, I've got all these siblings and I love them so much. And then I heard that, some people would, this is very, putting it kind of in its crudest, simplest form. When I was like 6 or 7, I'd be like, some people would hurt these babies instead of make sure that they were taken care of. And that, shocked me in a way that I think was appropriate. And I was like, okay, well, how does this, issue? It's like, it was as if I found out that thievery or murder was just, not being addressed in our civic system. I was like, oh, that should change. And so I started getting involved in learning how politics worked. And, and so then, of course, my issue set expanded as I learned about freedom and rights and, the foundations of a free society. And it's just continued to propel me in there. On the Pathfinder side, the whole chaplain thing basically is, as you said, Pathfinder blends that ministry aspect with the politics aspect, and that's something that we always did at Gen J as well. And I think that it's a distinctive that is is really vital, especially for students who are developing their worldview, developing their sense of identity. And frankly, politics is an inferior source of worldview and identity. Politics is downstream from
Amen.
that. Politics is downstream. You need to establish those things upstream, and faith is the best place for that. It's the superior place for that.
It's the
And
most
so
upstream you can get.
it's
Yeah.
about as the most upstream you can get, including that. I mean that like not to just it applies in places other than America, but that is an
Yes.
American foundational idea that even civic rights and social rights originate with God, not the king or man or something like that. They originate with heaven. And so
What was that? It said it like our Constitution was made for a moral and religious people. It's wholly inadequate for the governance of any other.
that's
Like that
correct.
was
Yeah.
understood right from the get go.
Yeah.
Absolutely correct.
And so with Pathfinder, my role as a chaplain, as grand as that might sound, I basically do our devotions and lead prayers and do things like that. But I think it's our commitment, all of us, to keeping our faith at the heart of all of it. And of course we're going to go wade into the issues of our day and do education and activism and advocacy. But those need to be, secondary, tertiary, whatever the area is for fourth, not the first thing. And Jesus
Correct.
is the first thing.
Yeah. We've from the get go, we wanted to make sure that that was not lost, which is why you don't see a lot of boards of directors that have a chaplain on them.
Yeah.
A few, obviously, but that's not the most common corporate position on a board.
Right.
But it was something we kind of cooked in right from the get go for the purpose of keeping leadership on track and then the
Yep.
organization flowing down from
Yep.
there. All right.
Well,
I'm going to keep
it's
us
an honor.
moving just because of the amount of time, because there's a lot to cover and we're going to wander deeper and deeper if we need to. But
Let's go.
now you work over at National Review.
That's right.
You have specifically a fellowship, I believe you're involved, the Burke to Buckley Fellowship. And part of that is cultivating principled leaders in this particularly, call it turbulent political moment. Is that a fair way to say that?
Sure.
Can you explain a little bit, like just take a minute, like, and what is that? For viewers or listeners who aren't familiar with this, and I'm personally not as familiar as I'd like to be, can you give me the 60-second version?
Absolutely, I can. So the Burke to Buckley Fellowship is this program that's been running for quite a while at National Review Institute. And think of it like the most rigorous, immersive book club and dinner club that you could imagine for conservatives. And so basically the idea is everyday adults. This is aimed at, like, say, mid-career professionals. So maybe they're teachers or doctors or lawyers, or they own a business or something. And maybe they have a bent towards conservatism already. Probably they do. But maybe they're like, how, I don't just want to be like, I vote Republican, or, this is what I think about immigration, or this is what I think about taxes. They want that intellectual and philosophical foundation. So how do we do that? We go back to those original sources. It's called Burke to Buckley because we go all the way back to Edmund Burke, and in the 1700s. And we go all the way forward to the 1950s and even beyond. But in the 1950s, William F. Buckley founded National Review, which was this leading conservative thought magazine in the 50s and to this day. And the program just it's phenomenal. Like it'll keep you busy with about 2 hours of reading every single week. And so it's like an 8-week course. And each week there's a reading assignment on a specific topic. Then we meet and have a really awesome dinner and all get in the same room. And we do this in kind of big cities around America. And we discuss, what it looks like and what issues are at play and, what makes sense and what doesn't make sense. Where's the tension? And so for anybody who's familiar with Gen J or anybody involved in Project Pathfinder, this is like many of those conversations, but for grown-ups who are like in the middle of busy lives with work and family, but they're taking the time to say, I want to go back and either refresh or in some cases establish for the first time, where did these ideas come from and what upholds them and ties them together. And it's just an honor to be involved with. It's really cool.
That's really cool because I think there's a lot of people that You see a lot of debate happening politically, but frankly, there's not a lot of effort, it seems, to know where ideas come from or to evaluate the sources of those ideas.
Yeah.
On the left or the right, at the moment, the right has slightly more of an intellectual tradition in that history, I
Mhm.
would argue, than maybe the left. But both of them have a tendency right now in current politics to not look at the why things are the way they are and where they came from. We see that with the kind of trashing of historic institutions or historic values or
Yeah.
propositions. Those often came with blood, sweat, tears, toil, treasure to get to those positions. And when you don't bother to understand why that thing is there,
Yeah.
moving it is a whole lot more casual of a thing versus when you're like, no, that is there for a very important reason. That is a load-bearing wall, culturally or civically, and it
Yeah.
needs to stay. That's fair. All right.
Principles are annoying because they restrain you as
Right.
much as they sustain you. Not to sound like some preacher with the rhyming, but
I mean, you
like
had the nice rhyming going there. There was a bit of that.
yeah, but the whole idea that like the temptation in politics is always come up with the justification for the thing I want, right?
Correct.
And
Correct.
people can do that. You can spin a
Oh,
tale
sure.
and find a quote and say, in the spirit of the founders,
Right.
XYZ. And it's like, I don't think any of them, we're talking about that.
Well,
And,
you and I've talked about that before when we're talking about our teaching and preaching, for example, at I Govern, where it's
yeah,
if you come to scripture and say, here is what I want to say, you can probably find a verse to back you.
sure.
That's, however, quite a bit different than saying, what does scripture say? That
Yeah,
lands you in a different spot. If you come in with a preloaded assumption, you're not being taught by a principle. You're
sure.
coming in and kind of force feeding your idea into it. And that applies
Right.
to history and historic documents with even less counterweight than it would to divinely inspired text, right?
Right. Sure.
You and I worked through the end of Generation Joshua after it closed its doors. It did almost 20 years of work. You and I saw that very up close, sometimes ludicrously, painfully, awkwardly up close. I still remember sending you to the back of a Walmart in Hawaii while we had storms happening, going, I don't care how you get water, you're getting water. And I'm pretty sure you were like buying it off the back of the truck and smuggling it around the island. So yes, someone
That
asked
is
us that
true.
story later. One of the things that happened in Gen J, and one of the things that we do a lot in Project Pathfinder now, is we work really diligently to build kind of this immersive in-person learning where you learn not just by having someone give you a piece of knowledge verbally or read a book. Those are both very good. We do plenty of that. We have a book club and some other stuff that we do just as well. But there's this kind of like hands-on immersion that is done to kind of develop civic skills, formation, like how to make things work. And you've long been an advocate of saying, hey, we have to actually do it, not just
Mhm.
talk about it.
Yeah.
Um, and I think from a learning perspective, it sounds like, at least with what you're doing with NRI, for example, even with this fellowship, there's an element of like you're getting together in person, you're learning civic community, you're discussing these in person. It's not just reading an article or something. That in person kind of community soaked aspect of it. Why is that so vital to like developing your kind of your principles, your foundations, like even your own maturity in those issues?
Yeah. That's a great question. It's probably so vital because other people have ideas and voices that don't match our own. And that sounds like a 101 fact, but like in our world that gets so digital and you can isolate so much and you can, mute people who you don't like. When you run into somebody across the room or in the same room, one, you're likely to see them like as a real person and not a one-dimensional comment or one-dimensional issue stance. And it's frankly often much easier to live out like what we're called to with our faith as like
Mhm.
loving our neighbor, even when our neighbor is like the crazy liberal whose ideas would melt down the country if they were in charge. And we don't have to agree with their ideas, but we can say, wait a second, but you're also my neighbor who helped me with my leaves. And you're like, we walk our dogs at the same time every morning.
Humanity comes back into
Yeah,
play.
you've got that
There's a relational
humanity.
aspect of it. Yeah.
Yeah. And then
I
not,
think I was going to say, sorry, it feels like today, though, people are getting pretty poor at the ability to actually have community, the ability to
right.
have those sorts of conversations.
Yes. Yeah. Well, and I think it's we've built in a lot of escape hatches to our day-to-day lives, and we can again, this is not some anti-technology blanket because we're using technology right now, but like we can insulate ourselves. We've been given the tools to insulate ourselves and entertain ourselves. And when I say entertain, I don't just mean like watch movies, but I mean like entertain
Distract.
ourselves with the specific reality that we would most prefer to live in, and
Yeah.
we feel most epic in, and we feel most like, oh yes, if I'm watching, reels every day, I'm not watching the dancing video reels, I'm watching like how to, own the libs or something like that. It's like,
Sure.
it gives us that like kind of sense of like, we're almost like that video game high where you're like, you feel like you accomplished a real mission, and it's like, no,
Even
that was
though
just pretend.
it's all
Like
pixels. Right.
you spend 3 hours trying to get past that level, and listen, I'm not anti video games, they're great, but if you
It's
think
true.
that's
I
a
can prove
real
that.
accomplishment, if you
It's
think
not.
that's a real accomplishment, it's not. It's fun. And
Yeah.
so, like, which fun is
There's
a
validity for
very
that. I'm not
good.
saying
It's
no,
a
but if
genuine
that's all
good.
you've got,
Yeah,
yeah.
and
It's
if you
funny.
conflate that with like the purpose that you were, meant to go and impact the world, that's
Yeah.
different.
Yeah. I think, Daniel, it's funny how often we run into people where they've never encountered someone outside of the bubble they sculpted for themselves.
Right.
And so, this happens on the left and the right, to be fair, but
Yeah.
they suddenly have no idea how to deal with someone that disagrees with them or has a different viewpoint in conversation.
Yeah.
So, and
And
I think that in-person communication is crucial just to developing basic social skills. And to be fair, the COVID lockdown for a couple of years ago definitely set back a lot of people in their ability to do that.
it did. It did.
I want to move into one of the kind of the current topic I wanted to chew through with you. Voters across the United States, in both parties, are being asked to choose between candidates, some of which carry some real baggage is the polite word, scandal is the less polite word, criminal activity is the possibility, in
Mhm.
like impeachments, accusations, etc. And I'm not talking we're talking stuff like local, state, etc. And it's weird. Like there's been this like, it seems like a giant spike in like a willingness to tolerate like flawed or deeply flawed leadership in our politically.
Mhm.
Like you think a lot about it, but you were talking about how your faith has to inform what you do and how it informs how you live in the world and it informs how you understand what it means to be a leader. So like maybe first up, like quick gut reaction to where we are right now with that reality.
Mhm. I mean, gut reaction, I don't love it. Like
Sure.
there's
Sure.
disappointment, there's pining, desire, wishing things were different than they are. And concern. There's concern, like, what does this mean? Because sometimes you have the sometimes you have the person with the poorer character but closer to your ideas,
Right.
and sometimes you have the person with maybe the better character but way further from your ideas. But
Right.
frankly, what we see a lot of the times, and this is where it gets really, in a sense, extra complicated, is we frankly will see kind of fairly morally bankrupt people on both sides, and then one of them has something that I wouldn't quite say speaks for my ideas, but is like many shades closer to my ideas
It's at
than
least in the same
say,
city, if not the neighborhood of my.
yeah, than say like somebody else who's not just kind of lukewarm or further on my ideas, but they're like running 100 miles an hour away in a way that like, a way that you'd be like, I can't just kind of not have great concern about that side. You know what I mean?
No, I hear you. I mean, okay, when you say that, it kind of leads me right into the next thing I wanted to bring up. There's this argument has been bouncing around culturally now for probably 20, 30. I mean, okay,
Yeah.
all the way back to it depends on what is, right? Like we get all the way back to Clinton as president, this idea of like the moral character of an individual,
Yeah.
like relative to and in light of their policy positions. And there's an argument that runs around that says we're electing, for example, a president, not a pastor, or insert
Sure.
office, right?
Sure.
We're not looking for some sort of like bastion necessarily, like we're not mandating a bastion of moral uprightness.
Yeah.
But at the same time, personnel become policy. The characters of
Yeah.
of a person in office often are reflected in how they govern and how the
Yeah.
implementation there. How do you respond to that kind of view? Like, at what point does the personal say, "I'm sorry, we can't go there with you because although I might agree with your policy, the personal or the ethical aspect of it is too much. But
Yeah.
there's another element where it's saying, you know what, we're not going to grant everything. And I'm like, I can get behind you. Like, how do you
Yeah.
navigate that line?
Well, I think, spoiler alert, I don't have the perfect answer. And
That's okay.
anybody who says that they do is probably trying to sell you something. But I think what I can share is the way that I consider it, and people who I respect consider it. I think the first thing is that kind of one-liner that you gave, we're trying to, like, to say a president and not a pastor.
Sure.
That is true.
Right.
And some people will just write that off to begin with, but that is true. A president and a pastor are very different things. Thank heavens.
Amen.
And I think it's fair to say that the qualifications, even like as somebody who is, again, I'm going to assume for the sake of this conversation, operating from kind of a traditional values Christian grid, because if you don't have faith, you don't really care you might care about the pastor, but like, that's not the through line for you.
Right.
So like to assume that grid, you have to get down to, what are the non-negotiable requirements for a leader. Right. And people have a lot of different takes on that, and I've sat through conventions and speeches where someone got up and basically said, yeah, if your candidate doesn't believe your particular theology and read your version of the Bible and raise their family just like you would raise your family or the way you were raised, then they just don't meet the bar. And that's, in my opinion, that is not a faithful biblical approach to Christian citizenship. However, neither
on the flip side.
On the flip side, you have people who would basically say, Donald Trump himself gave the "I could walk out into Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody," example, and he was being hyperbolic and it was just kind of a jab. But like, there are people who basically, it's like, if I found out that my guy killed some people and smuggled some money and did every number of horrible things, well, he'd still be my guy, and that's loyalty, and that's a virtue. Like, I've heard that line for you. It's like, this weird distorted version of loyalty is like basically ride or die. And we're more on the die no matter
what. But there's nothing you could do that would make me go, nope, I'm sorry, I'm getting off this train here.
And what's funny though is most arguments I've had with people, and I say arguments in the three-dimensional version. I don't mean the nasty vitriolic, but like, we're actually trying to persuade each other here.
Sure.
Center around where is that line? Where is that line for imperfection? Because again, if you think you're going to find Jesus running for office, he's not. He didn't have any nobody made it past the primary.
He got the crown. He doesn't need to run for office. It comes with the
that's what I'm
Lord of all component of the title.
I was going to say he had no challengers. He did have challengers, but they were like, kind of eternally and spectacularly thrown down.
And here's our chaplain coming in right there. Yes, absolutely.
So, anyways, so that's not the standard. Are you a full manifestation of every aspect of the character of God? That's unrealistic,
right?
But here's something that the people right now, everything I just said, the people who are like incredibly high candidate standard,
right?
They're like, yes, amen. And that's good because I believe all that stuff. I'm going to throw something to the other crowd, which is, in a society like ours, which is even the idea of I'm going to say secular, meaning a government that recognizes that the realm of the soul and the realm of the spirit is not something government has authority over. We're not a theocracy. Policy matters because, in a sense, it's the only thing that government has legitimate claim to. And so the idea that policy can just be kind of cast aside, and it's like, well, no, would I let them babysit my kids? And if I wouldn't, then there's no way I could vote for them. That's simple. It gives you some kind of like quick ways to be like, convince yourself not to vote for people, and I can respect that. But I think that some people will rush down that rabbit hole prematurely because it gives them a glow of self-righteousness and means they don't have to do the hard work of saying, what is that line actually? And what does that mean when I see, for example, if, because let's be really clear here. The options, if you are faced with the really like tough candidate choice with the kind of the worst of both worlds or something,
right?
Your options are pick one that you like,
right. Or pick
sit
none.
out,
yeah,
or pick one that you like that's not running, like write in.
Yeah.
You can pick one of the two, abstain, or write in. I think all three of those are very valid options for a person of faith. I can respect
in the right context at the right time.
In the right context at the right time. I can respect people incredibly who sit out. Now, I'll tell you, and this is just, I'm just honest feedback here. The respect that the thing that loses my respect faster than almost anything else in this situation is someone who say, let's, for sake of this audience, let's say they were a conservative and
Sure.
they found a candidate who was a real scumbag, and they were like, I can't in good conscience vote for this person. Okay.
Sure.
If that's true and you've prayed about it and you've looked at it and examined it and you can't, great. Then that is a consistent and respectable conviction. Now, the two things I'll say to that: one, this is, faith applied. And so your conviction, you can only hold that with you can't hold that with like the reality, the power of God's word. You can hold that with this is my discernment and
this
what I believe.
Conviction,
this
not
is my
divine
conviction.
revelation
This
from
is
on high. Right.
Precisely. And so you can hold that. The other thing you can do, though, and this is where loses my respect, is I've seen people kind of reflexively go, yeah, this person is trash. Thus, I'm going to not
the other way.
I can't vote for them, but thus it is now my righteous divine mission to bring them down, and I am going to vote for their opponent, who, in our polarized age, usually, if you're, say, starting place as a conservative, usually their opponent
philosophically
is
very problematic.
Is immensely problematic. And that greatly loses my respect.
Retaliatory politics.
Yeah, because it basically tells me, oh, so you are just your principles here. In a sense, that elevates character to an idol, because if character and policy matters in this situation, like, we don't just want a gushy gummy bear who loves everybody. Like that could.
You can have morally upright people that are incompetent leaders and have poor policy. You can also have really effective leaders that have serious moral issues. Both of them have their weaknesses.
Yes.
Right?
And that means it requires great discernment, because I can't tell you, there's not some like book I can crack open and say, well, according to line 13, your candidate has committed the 11th sin, which then means that the scale tips and now you can't vote for him. It's like, so this is why it's the annoying answer is like, I can't give you this great prescription. What I can give you is maybe my advice on the framework for saying,
sure,
what are your viable options? And when I say viable, I mean, like, I don't mean who can win, but like, for you as a Christian, what options do you have? This person, abstain, or, write somebody in. I will say, just, speaking bluntly, I tend to, as much as the character has become a sticking point in certain cases. And I want to say, before we exit this topic, I want to give an encouragement or a charge to the people listening, which is, don't play that tape of despair in every situation, because sometimes I'll have conversations with people and they're just like, yeah, all the candidates, their character is just awful, and I'm just going to throw my hands up and take my toys and go home, and I don't care what happens in the midterms, because all these people, and it's like, really, when it boils down to it, usually it's a few particularly awful people who have scored some big headlines, and that colors
everybody else.
Everybody
Right.
else. And so
Right.
you're, now maybe you do have a particularly scummy politician you're dealing with. That's a cross you have to bear, and you have to navigate that to the best of your conscience. But really, a lot of the times, there's some very decent people out there. And again, makes the case for getting involved early and often, because you usually have some much better options in, say, a primary cycle than you would even in a general if you're willing to
Okay.
get in there.
I want to dig on that, although I don't think I've ever heard someone compare politics with the cross you have to bear, but it is unfortunately painfully accurate as an analogy right now.
I mean, it's
At least in certain circumstances.
yeah.
That's
well, and not to be funny, but it's like,
sure,
deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow me.
Right.
That applies in civics sometimes, because even if it's just as simple as not snapping back on Twitter with what you really want to say.
Right. And you've heard me say this before, but there's this element of understanding that at least in a free country where we get to vote, there is a stewardship responsibility for us as citizens. So our vote and our engagement, at least in a representative government, is a responsibility that we have that does have an element of responsibility, whether you want to or not. It's not just a thing you can be flippant about. The quality of candidates, in theory, is something that gets in part vetted or evaluated via the party process in both parties. The primaries, the caucuses, the endorsements, the people that play in the primary process. The conventions. Oh my gosh, the conventions. The paper airplanes is a different story. Anyway, that being said,
conventions fan. That's my hot take. I have too much fun at them.
It's good stuff. I mean, I was involved in a rather dramatic mass meeting that involved a lot of that for just a local county thing, basically the county version of a convention a couple months ago, and it had all sorts of drama going on. I'm glad I went. It was very close. Several hundred people were there, and the difference was 30 votes. It matters a bit. So, how much of the candidate I think we can all agree that it would be better if we had morally upright individuals on both sides who had different philosophical points of view that they could clearly articulate, and people made intelligent decisions. That would be lovely, particularly with some good intellectual grounding on behalf of the voting populace and a high level of informed voters. We obviously know that what I'm spewing out there is a level of not real that I don't know if we're ever going to get around.
Isn't it weird to think that heaven's going to be even better than that? Because that sounds downright heavenly, what you're describing, and yet we're not even going to have to. We're not even going to have to do this whole figuring out human government. The
responsibility of governance goes away when we're back under a monarchy, and it's not the British one I'm talking about. Okay,
right.
What was the old battle cry during the Revolution? No king but King Jesus. Like, there's an element of that where they're recognizing even people that are sitting there working to go from a monarchy to a democracy or democratic republic. They're like, no. Theologically, I'm good with a monarchy.
Yeah.
I'm just very particular on the monarch. Okay,
That's right.
That aside, in this world, in this time, in this place, that is the reality we live in. So that being said, individuals involved in primaries, parties in the selection process, the party leadership, et cetera, we could agree that we would like better candidates, right? I guess the question is, how much, I don't know, call it responsibility is it for people? How much responsibility? So if we say that we have some personal responsibility for how we, for our citizenship, how much responsibility are we recognizing when we're saying, hey, we want better candidates? If we want better candidates, there's an element that both the parties have some responsibility to agree. They set the systems and the rules, right? And there's an element there, but also for people that speak on it, like NRI or Pathfinder or Gen J used to, et cetera, we can weigh in, put our voice in the conversation. But to actually improve the quality of candidates, like the moral quality or the character, as it were, what would we need to do to actually try and give ourselves better options? End of day.
Mm-hmm. Here's what I'll say. If you're one of my friends who, convince, and I say, I'm not saying this in a demeaning way, but they become convinced that I can't vote for that guy. I can't vote for this girl. I gotta write somebody in or abstain. It's if you do that enough times, well, sounds like you're getting pretty close to needing to run, my friend. It's
you're talking to, Daniel, that's what got me in when I had to run a couple of years ago. One of our students showed up and said, hey, you're frustrated by this. Do you believe what you say? Or you can actually put your pay to it? And so I did run for office and did that. It's hard work.
You served. It is. And not everyone should do it. But the there is that kind of if you're just, if you're just gonna always, no one's ever gonna be good enough type thing, then okay, well then one, what question is, how early are you getting involved and what are you actually doing? Because if you just want to be like a drive-through voter, like a fast food voter, we've now got early voting for 90 days, whatever it is. It's easier than ever to just kind of be, now one, voting at all is a big difference in civics. To go like back to 101 here, please vote. Like generally, at least consider yourself in, even if you, for example, wrote somebody in or something, please vote and be involved. Now, assuming you're a voter who's actually taking their civic duty seriously, don't, if you don't like the candidates you're seeing, if you don't like, who makes it to the top, actually go knock some doors in a primary. Actually go find somebody, go talk to, if you don't feel called to run for office, go find the best person who embodies, what you think our country needs right now and who you could enthusiastically support with your time, with your money, with your energy going out to knock doors or something like that. Like, I think in a sense, the pickier you get, the more I want to see you putting your money where your mouth is.
I have a lot more, call it grace, for someone who really cares about candidate quality, but is literally there helping organize the caucuses of the primaries. They're like, we are engaged. We're having the candidates to our house. That's one of the things when we were out in Iowa a couple of years ago, I loved how seriously the people we met there took national politics because they recognized their role in vetting candidates. And they're like, no. If someone's going to be president, I expect them to be in my town 8 to 10 times and to be in my house at least once. And they're like a farmer out in Ames. And it's like, you're a farmer in Ames, Iowa, and you expect the next president to be in your house. And they're like, yes. And they weren't wrong. They actually did. They would regularly pull that off. Well, I'm like, that's pretty amazing. That doesn't happen in every state. It does there. They're kind of unique in that regard. But that level of engagement and responsibility means if they're complaining about candidate quality, I'm willing to give them more of a pass because they've put the time and effort and blood, sweat, and tears in.
That's right.
Whereas someone who's like, I hate the candidates. By the way, I don't even vote half the time. In the general, I don't vote anything else. I'm like, well, if you really are wanting to complain, do the work first.
Yes. And also, we got
you're allowed to be a complainer if you're not a quitter. If you quit, you don't get to complain, right?
I like that. Yeah. The thing, the other thing is like, and this is an icky one, but there is the whole idea that Congress reflects the citizenry. And
that's kind of disturbing sometimes.
I don't, of course there can be some exceptions, and I'm not trying to ding the whole American citizenry here, but like, you can't, in many ways, even with real concerns about candidate quality and stuff, I think you can also look at issues in society and people, even ourselves sometimes, and the things we all, our own weaknesses and sins and struggles. And we can, kind of say, oh, wait, you know what? Like, yes, candidate quality matters. Also, and this comes back to that full circle of faith and morality and virtue mattering, is like, if we embrace this idea that, virtue, morality, a life of integrity, it doesn't really matter, at least not in the way it used to. And then you're surprised when suddenly you feel like your members of Congress are scummier than ever. It's like, okay, well, maybe
I can't imagine how we got there. Let me think about that
maybe we're
bit.
getting what we deserve in some of these cases, and that is, that's not nice, because then it makes us all wrestle with our personal responsibility, and we're like, I wasn't really involved. I was just trying to hold my job, but these things matter in a republic where these people are representing us. And I think I think just coming back to that idea that you're balancing, you figure out where you feel conviction as far as your ultimate character cutoff, but then also in that mix needs to be, in a sense, the starker, the more stark the policy difference, the more, if I was going to, for example, consider just like abstaining or something like that in a political contest, I would need to be, and this is just kind of talking about the polarization of politics, but it's like the matchup is usually so intense as far as the ideologies on display, that in some ways that bar, you have to keep it to like whatever you believe the core of that is, because if you start just kind of adding your want list on top of your need list,
Sure.
you're just going to rule yourself out and be pretty ineffective. And frankly, there is an imbalance there where it can become a dereliction of duty in a moral sense when you just kind of say they weren't good enough and I couldn't really be bothered to try, for example, and advance this policy that I believe is an issue of fundamental human rights,
Sure. And you and I've talked about that on the life issue before, when it's like,
Yeah.
do we try and make it better, or do we try for perfect? And sometimes perfect becomes the enemy of better.
That's right.
I get that. All right. Let me ask you this, though. There are plenty of students we encounter here, and they look at what's happening in the world around them. They look at the world that they're growing up into, and they're expected to pick up the responsibilities of citizenship in the middle. They don't have, decades of experience or perspective. They haven't read all the books yet. They're working on it, but they have a large stack. I understand that. And it leaves them looking cynical or discouraged at politics. They have conversations with their peers, and that doesn't usually make it any better. The cynicism even invades my house with my kids, and I totally get it. I'm like, that's not true, but that's what they hear and consume. And they kind of wonder, is this even worth it anymore? If you could say one thing to kind of encourage them or respond to that, what would you tell them?
Yeah, that's a great one. I would say it is 100% worth it, because humanly speaking, this thing that we've been entrusted with, this United States of America, is the most beautiful, the most free, the most progressing, not in the leftist progressive sense, but in the sense of progressing towards liberty and justice for all, in any time or place in human history. I talk to people who have concerns about our country. I talk to people who have concerns about our politics. Point to a country that has done it better at any type of length of scale. Like, what we've been entrusted with is a jewel in human history. Now, I'm not one of these people who's going to idolize my country, but I will thank my God for my country. It's like this is something that, for all of the flaws and all of the imperfections, we've been entrusted with a level of freedom, prosperity, security, good, like actual good lives for people at scale.
Sure.
Even if you look at the poorest among us, even if you look at the least free among us, compare that to any other time in history. Compare that to the era of, pagan empires. Compare that to the era of even, monarchies in Europe. Like, our poor, not to say that poverty isn't still a real issue in America, but our poor are living different lives than the poor in, say, ancient Greece.
Sure. And many other countries around the world today.
Our prisoners are living a quality of life and respect for their God-given rights, and even, dare I say, comfort. Not that prison is comfortable, but they're like, in a very fundamentally speaking, the prisoners would have to be the least free among us, and even by definition, the least free are being treated at things that, if we look at any other time in history, it's like, what have you all been in? How did you build this? How did you do this? What's going on here? What's different? And, I think
it's back to that point of comparing what it is versus having some real standard of equivalency.
Yeah.
I think sometimes we can get all wrapped up with like looking ingrown eyebrows. We can't actually look at it in broader context.
And I ask people whenever they talk about the issues that face our country today and those things that will get us, to feel discouraged or something.
Sure.
What are we comparing that to? Because I tell you, take any issue in America today that concerns, say somebody who's like, you're looking at it and it's like, I don't like this about my country. Okay, what country, and take it today, snapshot today, whatever date we're recording this, what other country, whole package, is doing it better?
Daniel, I had an ending, but I'm not sure I could trump that right there. But at the same time, as we head toward our 250th anniversary and like the 4th of July coming up in about a month, like, understand I think I love the word use, the jewel that we have.
Yeah.
Not perfect, but truly a treasure. And you put it in a great context for it. I'm really glad to be able to have it there. Now, I think I have to wrap it here tonight, but I just wanted to say thank you for joining me. Thank you for the conversation. It has been so good to have this sort of conversation with you. I miss being able to have this up and down the hallway, but at least in
Yes.
this format, now everyone else gets to see it too. So thank you very much for coming.
Thanks
Any
for having
last
me.
words or stuff where people can follow you and your work or what's happening with NRI or other stuff you want our listeners to know before I wrap us up?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. Well, first of all, this was a absolute blast, and I will happy to come back anytime. And if you want to follow what's going on with National Review Institute, you can go to nrinstitute.org. You can also go to nationalreview.com. I will say one thing I just have had for years with Gen J students, with students today, is people say, where's a good source for news? Like, where's a place that's like actually trustworthy, and how do we know it's true? And how do we, know that we're not just being spun? And, there's like a whole lot to be said about that topic. But one place that before I was ever in a working relationship with them, National Review genuinely was one of those places that I would go for, not to tell me. I'm not just going to download, what one article says and says this is going to, just tell me what to think, because that's lazy, right? That's intellectually lazy. But they host some of the most deeply articulated pieces for conservative thought, and that's been their role for a long time. It's one of the reasons I'm glad to work there. And so if you're wondering either an issue, or you're like, what's going on, or what are the strains of thought about this, what principles apply here from a conservative liberty mindset, go check out some of their articles, consider subscribing, something like that. It's very helpful, and it can help you in your pursuit of what is true and what is good and what is just. And there's some great thinkers and writers over there, so I'd encourage people to check that out.
Awesome. Well, thank you. We'll include a link to that in the show notes for this, for those people to look at it. We'll also have a link to your Spotify if people want to hear your musical talents.
Yeah,
because those are
absolutely.
entirely worth hearing. But it is always a pleasure to see you, Daniel. For you guys listening at home, if this is your first time listening or hearing about Project Pathfinder, you can head to projectpathfinder.net to find out more about our programs and educational opportunities. You can find us on Instagram, LinkedIn, Facebook, and of course at the Project Pathfinder HQ YouTube channel, as well as a little bit more there than you would at any of the other streaming platforms. Subscribe to the Project Pathfinder Report wherever you're listening so you can catch future episodes, and we hope to see you all back here next time when we continue walking down the path. Thank you so much, and have a great night.